Fox News has called Virginia's governor's race for Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin. Go to foxnews.com for the latest.
I'm Greg Gutfeld.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm Brett Baer, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, November 3rd, 2021. I'm Lisa Brady. A persistent supply chain backlog could lead to a not-so-happy holiday season.
It's going to be a problem, and it's going to start hitting. It's already hitting. But certainly November and December are going to be tough months for a lot of purchases on you name it.
I'm Chris Foster. The Supreme Court takes up challenges to abortion cases in Texas and soon Mississippi.
The court is going to have to decide whether it wants to give states some more flexibility. It could even decide to simply get rid of Roe v. Wade.
And I'm Joe Concha. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
About 40% of shipping containers entering the U.S. pass through 2 California ports, which continue to have a backlog, despite President Biden's push for more of the supply chain to run 24/7.
Supply chains are something that most of our citizens never think twice about until something goes wrong.
He brought the issue with him to Europe, telling other G20 leaders that ending the pandemic is what's needed to end the disruptions. A simultaneous pitch for vaccinations and infrastructure investments to help prevent a future backlog. Florida has been investing in its ports.
Since I became governor in 2019, we've allocated almost $1 billion to over 70 Florida seaport projects.
Governor Ron DeSantis says they have the capacity to help alleviate logjams, though the Biden administration has also pointed to an outdated supply chain infrastructure among shippers and retailers, not able to handle surging demand. California's twin ports of LA and Long Beach plan to start fining shipping companies later this month for containers waiting to be unloaded for too long, a 3-day limit if they're supposed to move by rail, 9 days if scheduled for trucking.
If I was going to point at one thing where there could be some help, I think we're all looking at, and even here in Florida, there is still a shortage of truck drivers out there.
Michael Rubin is president and CEO of the Florida Ports Council.
That is going to be an area of weakness regardless of where you go. And I think that's one area where certainly if we were to do something on a federal level, I know there's some regulations they could lift at least. There's issues with allowing 18-plus-year-olds to drive, but some of them would be quite capable, and why not at this time looking to get more of those individuals on the roads, because that truck driver will help not only with people are learning about chassis and those things as well, so you need somebody to move those as well. So I think if you're looking for a problem that is nationwide that could be something that could be done right now to help with some alleviation would be probably, trying to get more truck drivers on the road.
I wanted to dig in a little deeper on that because, at least anecdotally, some truckers dispute reports of an actual trucker shortage, and they say it is just an issue of not getting chassis quickly enough to move goods out of warehouses so more containers can be unloaded from ships, kind of a snowball effect. So how does that process work in Florida? Is it different in Florida than it is when a trucker drives in to pick up a load in a California port?
Certainly over on the West Coast, where there are, an inordinate amount of containers, you have, chassis pools and chassis companies and the like that own some of those that deal with that issue. But it's still, we have a little bit out of Florida. It's not as bad. Certainly some of our drayage, the distance from our port to wherever the heck they're dropping that chassis off may not be as significant. So they do have some of that issue in California where they're trying to get that chassis returned to the chassis pool operator. We don't have as much chassis pool operators as they do over there. And I certainly couldn't speak to the specific on the chassis over there, but you do need somebody to move that chassis from where it's at, whether it's empty or not, whether it has an empty container on it or not, back to the port proper to try to get that there. So I'm sure, while there may be truckers waiting on that chassis, I think that's probably true over there. Somebody's got to move that chassis back.
We should probably clarify when we say chassis, we're talking about the part of the truck that the driver is driving, right? That attaches, that they would put the container on. Because I always had this vision in my mind anyway, which turns out to be the wrong vision, I guess, of, a driver sort of driving the cab up to the port to have it loaded up and and take stuff away. And that isn't, they're kind of a lot of them are independent contractors, and they're showing up in their own car and they're picking up a chassis to get a load onto it, right?
It runs the gamut. We have independent truckers, we have trucking companies, just depends on how it's moving. But that chassis is kind of that back bed that you might see, the cab. So you could have a trucker driving his own cab, and then you need to hook to the chassis, and then you need to drop the container on that chassis.
It's kind of three parts, really.
So exactly. There's three parts. Yeah. Well said. And so, they all three kind of fit into this mix at some point. So there's plenty of those containers, that may be empty, which is another story, trying to get those empties out of the way too. But it's there are issues with the chassis itself in some cases, and they probably are not owned by the truck driver. They may not be owned by the trucking company. They may be owned by an independent entity that is a chassis /pool owner. So there's a number of players in this craziness, and it tends to not be easy at some point if everybody's not working together on it.
I know that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has called your ports, a model for the country, talked about the investments that have been made over the past few years. And he has highlighted the fact that Florida has gotten some more shipping business recently. For instance, Jack's Port hadn't had a European container ship in years, and then had one in October. Another big one came from India into Port Everglades. Is that happening because there's such a backlog at other ports, especially California, or is that because sort of the word is out that Florida made these investments and now you can handle bigger containers there?
I would say both. Certainly when I've said this before, when people looked at Florida years ago, and we're primarily talking about an east-west trade route in Asia anyway, but those trade routes have really started shifting and really shifted with the opening of the Panama Canal several years ago. So we've been investing and trying to make sure everybody knew that Florida was a place that you could come to conduct that business. We weren't the end of the road. We, in fact, could be the beginning of the road especially for vessels coming out of the Panama Canal. And we started getting more vessels from the Suez, including what you just talked about at Jacksonville. So we've made those investments. I think the highlight of the problems with the supply chain, especially over in between Asia and California, which has been a supply chain route for years, but it's reached its capacity. And this has been an opportunity for us to tell those shipping lines and carriers and others involved in it, especially if you're trying to shift that cargo to the East Coast of the United States. We have the capacity to deal with a lot of those vessels now. We've got the post-Panamax cranes. Miami has dredged, is dredged was one of the, I think, maybe the second port on the East Coast of the United States that dredged to 50 feet. Jacksonville will be at that depth soon, and Everglades is making that depth as well. But still, Jacksonville and Everglades, as you mentioned, can take those larger vessels. Sometimes they can't be fully loaded when they go into those two ports, but they can handle those vessels. They have the cranes that can reach across and pull those containers off. So we've made a lot of investments to improve the ability and capacity of our ports to deal with those larger container vessels. Meanwhile, we've got some pretty busy ports in the Gulf Coast as well. They primarily deal with a little bit of the smaller vessels out there, but they've been growing rapidly in the movement of goods as well.
As someone who deals with ports, for a living, really, I mean, did you see any of this coming? Is this an issue that's been bubbling up for a while? Is it really just is it mainly driven by post-pandemic issues or recovering from the pandemic issues? The White House has talked about, just more consumer demand. We're just, buying more stuff and more stuff is being shipped here. Did you foresee any of this?
It's been a discussion. If you look at some of the House Commerce and a little bit over in the Senate as well, Transportation Infrastructure Committee, they've talked about freight for a bit. It just wasn't one of those issues that they gave a lot of credence to. But we haven't invested properly in this country's freight infrastructure for a while. And, I look at the supply chain task force set up by, the president's administration, and I'm glad he's doing that. But again, it's focused on, I understand the focus on, there's other issues with respect to that, including where we're purchasing things like chips and other stuff from. But if you're talking supply chain and you don't have seaports and truckers and everybody else involved in that discussion, then you're not really focused on supply chain. You're focused on manufacturing products. So it doesn't get the attention that it deserved. And we knew, a lot of us knew that, we've been trying to get more money to it. Both presidents have put some money into it. Yet President Trump put some more money into it. Certainly, I'm hopeful that President Biden will put some more money into it. But it's been an issue for a while. And I think it's just, COVID highlighted it a little bit because it pressed it. But it's not going away.
Well, one last thing, and it may be the toughest question of all. Are you and your family personally worried about getting or sending holiday gifts in time?
My wife, a very smart woman, although she married me, had already done a number of the holiday shopping we had. So she got it out of the way. I guess that's what she gets for being married for so long to a supply chain nerd. So, yeah, she's out there. But, you're seeing it, and you're going to see it in groceries. You're going to see it for, just normal things you're used to buying. Certainly anybody that's done Amazon shopping and remembers the days of 1 to 2 days shopping off Amazon is now getting a stark reality on that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a problem, and it's going to start hitting. It's already hitting, but certainly November and December are going to be tough months for a lot of purchases on you name it.
Well, Michael Rubin, President CEO of the Florida Ports Council. Good luck as the supply crunch continues, I guess. And thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it, Lisa. Thank you.
This is Joe Concha with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
The Supreme Court on Tuesday heard arguments about the law in Texas allowing civil lawsuits against anyone helping a woman get an abortion. Justices heard two challenges, one from the Biden administration, another from abortion providers in Texas. And they aren't for now considering the constitutionality of the law. This is just about the right to challenge it and to try to stop Texas judges and court clerks from hearing those abortion lawsuits. Justice Elena Kagan says about the law using private citizens to do the enforcement, not the state of Texas, through a criminal statute that would go against federal abortion rights.
The fact that after, these many years, some geniuses came up with a way to evade the commands of that decision, as well as the command that the even broader principle that states are not to nullify federal constitutional rights.
She says she doesn't understand the legal argument for it.
Many of the justices seemed exasperated by what was done here.
Jonathan Turley is a Fox News contributor, a constitutional law expert, and a professor at George Washington University.
In some ways, the law itself suffered from overkill. Not only did they make this a private enforcement mechanism, which made it difficult to enjoin, but they also imposed some pretty draconian provisions. They allowed for pro-life litigants to recoup their attorney's fees, but barred it for the other side. They allowed people to file in any district in Texas instead of the one that they reside in. There were a lot of provisions like that raised the ire of even conservatives on the court, asking why did you need to go this far? So I think that they may have lost Roberts and Kavanaugh on the merits. But it does come down to this very difficult question. On the other side, there are legitimate questions about what the court is being asked to do here. It is not very common for a court to tell state clerks, don't even allow a case to be filed. Don't allow it to even be heard. Don't allow people to state their case. That's a pretty extreme measure. And it's not clear yet how the court is going to deal with that.
Could it be a case where, look, we've got to have a test case and have one of these lawsuits be seen through from start to finish, and then we can discuss it?
Yeah, some of the justices were saying, look, you're complaining that this creates a chilling effect because it takes a while to get it to us by the usual means. And justices said, well, there's lots of laws like that restrict the First Amendment or gun rights. And, we don't intervene until clerks don't allow these cases to be filed. So those are very good arguments. The court could try something novel. They could just refuse to impose the injunction, but accept the case for review on the merits. Now, this was essentially an acceptance of the court before judgment. So basically, they were allowing argument to see if they wanted to take the case. They could do that without imposing an injunction or come up with some more novel construction. It does seem to me like there's a majority on the court that is inclined to view the statute unconstitutional in part or in whole. Just judging from the statements of Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh. What is also interesting is that this is really not the major abortion case. That case is the Dobbs case, and it's not out of Texas, it's out of Mississippi. And that is supposed to be argued in a matter of weeks. So this is all throwing the docket into a bit of disarray.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that if the Texas law is allowed to stand pending challenges, the whole thing could be rendered moot anyway if the abortion ruling comes down before the Texas ruling is ever stopped. Now, explain what the Mississippi case is and why that's clearly potentially more of a game changer for abortion.
Well, the Dobbs case has been a great concern for good reason for pro-choice advocates. First of all, many cases involving abortion have multiple issues that give these types of off-ramps for the court. If they do deadlock or they can't resolve an issue, they often find a way to send the case back down or limit the basis of the decision. Dobbs is direct and unavoidable. It simply asks whether states can enact these types of limitations or prohibitions during what's called the pre-viability stage. Now, Texas is incredibly early in that stage. They're at 6 weeks, which is really the earliest of the state laws that we've seen come before the courts. Mississippi allows twice that, but it's still, or basically a little over twice that, but it still is banning abortions in that so-called pre-viability stage. So the court is going to have to decide whether it wants to give states some more flexibility. It could even decide to simply get rid of Roe v. Wade and Casey, the case that followed it. Most of us would be surprised if they had an outright reversal of Roe. It wouldn't sit well with figures like Roberts, who's a bit of an incrementalist. He gets sticker shock on opinions. Kavanaugh is very much like Roberts. And that was always the irony. Trump, when he appointed Kavanaugh, said that he didn't want another mistake like Roberts, which was, I think, unfair to Roberts. But that was the sort of premise that he wanted a, quote, real conservative. And at the time I wrote that was a rather curious choice because Kavanaugh is very similar to Roberts, even when he was nominated. And he's turned out to be that on the court. He tends to be more of an institutionalist and incrementalist, much like Roberts.
So what might they do? What might the off-ramp be for Dobbs?
I don't think there is an off-ramp. It has a single question. Usually we have a multiplicity of questions before the court. This does not have an easy procedural question that they can turn to. They're going to have to address it straight up. And that means that this newly constituted majority, which includes Justice Barrett, is going to have to rule on the continued viability of Roe and Casey. Now, Barrett, when she was a law professor, wrote extensively on Roe, and she questioned the basis of Roe. And she had some very profound and interesting ideas, but she was legitimately viewed as someone who was not enthusiastic about Roe. So we're going to see if that has changed now that she is sitting in one of 9 chairs.
Is it necessarily very ominous for people who are pro-choice and necessarily cause to celebrate for people who are anti-abortion, that they even took this case in the first place. That obviously, if they took it up, there's other courts may not have taken in the past a case this cut and dry. Does it signal that they want to make a decision on it?
I think it does. I think it is ominous. There's two cases that seem clearly designed for this newly constituted conservative majority. One of them is a case to be argued, the Braun case. That case seems to have been selected for the sole purpose of reversing the Second Circuit and reaffirming gun rights. This is also that type of case. The single question presented in Dobbs really has all the makings of a case selected by the conservative side of the court.
What do you think of Roe? Even some legal experts who are pro-choice have said, look, it's just not a good law.
Well, Roe itself really doesn't exist anymore. Roe was built around Blackmun's view of the trimester type of methodology, that we would break the periods into three trimesters, and then the state's authority would grow with time. That was largely tossed out in Casey. That is, Casey years later was a decision of the court that said we don't want that methodology anymore, and instead they adopted the undue burden test, that you're not allowed to impose an undue burden on abortions. But of course, that standard itself is quite ambiguous. What constitutes an undue burden? So the question for the court in this term is, as a threshold matter, do they still believe that this is a constitutional right or something that should be left to the states? Most people expect that they will continue to recognize it as a constitutional right. And then the second question is, do we still believe that states should have a limited role early on in pregnancies in imposing limits or outright prohibitions after a period of time? That's the area that should worry pro-choice advocates. This does have the makings of a potential significant rollback on Casey.
And when might that happen?
Well, this isn't even going to be heard until December, so we're talking many weeks away before we have any type of decision. So it's not going to be something that's right away, but it will occur. We will get the decision before the midterm elections. And so, we already have great division in the country over the Supreme Court and calls for it to be packed. If the Supreme Court were to come out with a very strong gun rights decision in Braun, come out with a pro-life type of decision in Dobbs, that politicalization of the court is likely to be magnified for the midterms.
And a lot of Republicans, not that they aren't all necessarily anti-abortion, but there could be a bit of the dog catching the car. What do I do with it now? Because for so many years, Republicans have run on we're going to stop abortion.
Yeah, I expect that abortion and the Supreme Court will continue central in our politics. Keep in mind that even if the court were to take the unlikely step of just getting rid of Roe and Casey, that would just simply return the issue back to the states. Most states would still be pro-choice. There would be likely 12 to 15 states where the battleground would shift to the states. But any type of decision like that would simply affirm it as a state issue, not to ban abortions as a decision of the Supreme Court.
Jonathan Turley is a Fox News contributor, law professor at George Washington University, a constitutional law expert. That's why we bring him on from time to time for these conversations. Jonathan, it's good to talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
Did you hear the news? Now you can. With instant updates from Fox News for Amazon Alexa. Just say,
Alexa, play news from Fox.
In Fox News.
It's the latest when you need it, on demand from Fox News and Amazon Alexa. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Joe Concha.
What's on your mind?
President Biden fell asleep at a climate change conference in Glasgow for the world to witness. And it's a fitting symbolism for this absentee president. An absentee president on the U.S. southern border, a crisis he refuses to see up close by visiting said border. A president asleep at the wheel on Afghanistan, where U.S. service members died and hundreds of Americans are still trapped behind enemy lines. A president only adding to inflation fears by pushing trillions more in new spending. A president who doesn't address rising violent crime in American cities. And a president who won't go to America's ports, where hundreds of cargo ships are stuck with no resolution to this supply chain crisis in sight. Here's two numbers to chew on. NBC News poll, 71%, more than 7 in 10 of Americans say this country is on the wrong track. Just 36%, a smidge over 1/3 of Democrats, mind you, say Mr. Biden is the best choice for the party to be its nominee in 2024. Joe Biden, he got some shut-eye in Scotland, making Donald Trump's nickname for him, Sleepy Joe, perhaps his most accurate yet. I'm Joe Concha.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network, subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.